planned this course basically to give an overview of American history. As Jack pointed out, my main interest has been, professionally at least, for many years, teaching American literature at the Academy, at the Senior Center, at UCCS, places like that. And I realized that there's probably more interest in American history than purely literature. However, in this course, I will, from time to time, refer to the various literary works that I've talked about over the years as they relate to specific elements of American history that I'd like to bring out during these periods. I have tentatively planned about a 14-hour course, which means there'll be 14 weeks starting today. Again, having never taught this course, having never organized it in this way before, I'm not sure whether the 14 hours will be too long or too short, but at least I will try to shape what I want to say in an overview of American history, starting with the 13 colonies today and coming down through the Roosevelt administration, FDR that is. I know most of us here are old enough to have lived the history since Roosevelt, and some of us are old enough to have lived it before Roosevelt. But so I don't feel I need to talk about the more recent history. We know what it's about because we've lived through it and no doubt have observed it. So that's the intention, at least, in doing the course. So to begin with then, today I will start off with the origin, essentially, of our 13 colonies that eventually became what we are today, the United States. As we all know, the 13 original colonies had been preceded by many explorations, very few of them having to do with the English-speaking peoples of the world. Spain, France, Holland, Portugal, all preceded us, preceded the English, that is, in doing explorations of what we now know as the two American continents, North and South America. I've simply listed here, just briefly, 4 of those that were very influential. There were other explorations even earlier. Leif Erikson, for instance, in the year 1000 is reported to have explored the Newfoundland coast and Iceland. But we all know that we have given credit to Christopher Columbus for having discovered America. His was the first expedition looking for a route to India from Spain. Interesting comment before I go on. Every one of these 4 were Italians by birth. Not a one of them sailed under the Italian flag because there was no such thing as modern-day Italy, of course. There were city-states on the Italian peninsula, none of which had influence enough or resources enough to send out individual explorers on their own. Each of these went to some foreign country to get subsidies and to get the necessary resources necessary to make the explorations they made. Columbus, as we all know, went to Spain under King Ferdinand and Isabella and persuaded them that he could find a route to India, not by sailing around Africa, the way which had been done before by people like Marco Polo and others, but that he could find a western route to India. And so he headed west, hoping and expecting that he could find his way to India, which had been discovered by then and which was a source of many of the raw materials and luxuries that both the European countries enjoyed at that time. But as we all know, he didn't make it to India. He thought he had. He died expecting and hoping that he had found India. That's why we call American Indians Indians, because he thought they were Indians, and he said, "I found Indians. They don't wear many clothes, but they are obviously they're Indians." He had never been to India either, of course. That's how we came to be known as American Indians rather than the Native Americans, which we now call them mainly. Secondly, another man, Amerigo Vespucci, A-M-E-R-E-G-O, Amerigo Vespucci. Another Italian, a Florentine this time, who also got permission to take a trip to the west, looking for lands. He skirted the coast of South America. Many people think he came as far north as perhaps Florida and went back. And because after he came back to Europe, a German photographer made a map of the unknown country that he called Novus Mundi, the New World. Vespucci gave that a Latin title, which is now translated the New World, to what we now know as North and South America and all the islands around us to the east side. Emerson had some interesting things years later to say about Vespucci. I will read you what Emerson said. He said, Emerson thought we should have been called Columbia after Columbus. And so he was very irritated, much too late for his irritation to have any meaning. He was very irritated that we were not named after Vespucci. He said, a pickle dealer who managed in this lying world to supplant Columbus and to baptize half the earth with his own dishonest name. That was Ralph Waldo Emerson writing in the 1850s that his indignation that we were named after Amerigo Vespucci rather than Christopher Columbus. Another one, and the only English one among this group who sailed under England, he too was an Italian who went to England and was commissioned to go and look for discoveries. He sailed along the Newfoundland coast, and many think he got as far down as the coast of North Carolina before he headed back to India. He made 2 expositions, the first one in 1498. The same year, Verrazano, another Italian, came over and explored along the coast and discovered the entrance to the Hudson Bay. And as you know now, if you're from New York, the Verrazano Bridge that now connects Staten Island, New Jersey, was named after Verrazano. Those are 4 of the people who did major explorations of our side of the Atlantic. As you know, Portugal, Spain, France, even Sweden, and the Netherlands preceded the English by many, many decades in making explorations, and that's why South America now speaks Spanish rather than English. It was and Portuguese, as you remember, in Brazil. So the English were very, very late getting involved in the exploration game. They tried very hard to early on. Sir Walter Raleigh, in 1585, sent an expedition to this country under John White, who settled a small colony in Roanoke Island off the coast of North Carolina, at which and the Queen called him back to England because they were having war with Spain. He was unable to come back. He never came physically himself to Roanoke Island, but he sent John White and a group of colonists there. They settled on Roanoke Island. John White was summoned back to England because of the war with Spain, and the Spanish Armada was threatening England at that point. He went back to England. They finally managed to defeat the Spanish Armada, and when they came back in about 1591, the colony had disappeared. It is now known as the Lost Colony. We do know that one thing from the records that were kept at the time, that the first English girl, baby, born in America, her name was Virginia Dare, D-A-R-E, was born of that original colony, which disappeared. When they came back looking for it, it had simply disappeared. The site of the colony was still there. It was pretty well in ruins. They assumed that either the Indians had attacked or that the colonists, because they were dependent on the Indians for food, had joined the Indians and had intermarried with them and had simply dispersed. It has never been conclusively proven what happened to that colony. That was in 1585. The first permanent English settlement, as we all know, was in Jamestown under the Captain John Smith, who brought a group of adventurers who came largely not to settle and to establish a colony, but to make money. They thought there was gold. They'd mine pyrites for the first year or two thinking they had gold until it was chemically analyzed and determined to be simply iron pyrites and therefore worthless. There is no gold in Virginia to mine, as we all know. But the colony did survive. They lost a good number of the people on the way over. I think, as I remember the numbers, and forgive me if I have to look because my memory, remember I'm almost 92 and I don't remember as well as I used to. There was 144 who came over on the original colony with Captain John Smith. 39 of them died at sea. The rest landed. By the end of that year, the first year, more than half of them had died of starvation or disease. It was the colony, in other words, was totally unsuccessful from a commercial standpoint. Most of the people who had ventured to come to Jamestown from England were adventurers or noblemen's younger sons. You remember the primogeniture was in effect then. The oldest son got all the estate, and if you were a young son, you had to scrabble for yourself, either go in the military, the ministry, or find something better to do. A few of them who came with the Jamestown group were indeed sons of noblemen. That gave rise to the idea that Virginia was a cavalier state. They never lost the cachet of being cavalier. They always, if you're an FFV, First Family of Virginia, you like to think your ancestor was one of those cavaliers. It's unprovable, but it makes a good social claim, and they still make that claim. In any case, they did survive just barely. In 1610, 3 years after, and they were just hanging on barely, Sir John Gates, was his name John? Thomas, I'm sorry, I got him up there. Sir Thomas Gates came over from England because he decided they needed more discipline. Captain John Smith had tried to discipline them, but they actually sent him back to England in exile at one point. These people hadn't come to work. They'd come to get rich off gold. They didn't have any experience as farmers, certainly not as settlers. They simply were incapable of doing what needed to be done to survive on their own. Gates came over and managed to organize and to discipline some of these lazy or unwilling to work ex-noblemen, and many of them were not noblemen, and a lot of them claimed to be. And so the colony did in fact survive. And luckily, in 1614 or 15, John Rolfe, who had come with the original group, discovered through the Indians that tobacco could be cured and sent to England. And therefore, from that point on, the colony in Virginia began to flourish based on its export of tobacco to England. And that, in effect, tobacco saved that colony economically and socially as well. John Rolfe, incidentally, we all know the old story of Captain John Smith. He was a wonderful advertiser. He should have been working for the advertising industry in this country. He went back to England, wrote an account of his colony in which he claimed, and he did make friends with the Indians, but he also made a lot of enemies. But on one occasion, he claimed he had been captured by the Indians, and that Pocahontas, the daughter of the chief, had they were getting ready to behead him, and she said, no, don't do that, and she saved his life. There was indeed a Pocahontas, but she married John Rolfe, and he took her to England. And there's no truth whatever in John Smith's story, which he didn't write until about 5 or 6 years after it's supposed to have happened, that he was saved by Pocahontas. Pocahontas was indeed a living person, the daughter of a chief of one of the tribes nearby, who did marry John Rolfe, and he took her to England. The point is, the whole purpose of the Jamestown colony was essentially economic. There was nothing ideological, nothing theological, nothing idealistic about it. It was a commercial venture from the very beginning, and it remained that way most of the time, and thank goodness for tobacco, which we now know not to have been perhaps a blessing after all, but it became very popular in England and later throughout Europe. And so the tobacco crop in Virginia eventually or saved that colony, saved it and kept it viable, and it had survived. Incidentally, the Byrd family achieved. He came a little later, and he achieved a tremendous amount of land and acreage. He ended up his life owning 186,000 acres of land in Virginia. Kind of amazing. People got rich off it, but it was largely off the land, off the productivity of the land, not off anything mining. Of course, they used furs. The fur trade was important, as well as the tobacco trade. So much for the Jamestown colony, which was, of course, the first permanent English settlement on what is now the United States. Not the first permanent settlement on the continent, however. In 1609, there was a Dominican mission in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which they didn't even know existed at that time. The Spanish had come up from Mexico and had settled what is now the New Mexico area, and even Coronado, as we know, even made an excursion into what is now Colorado, and by many accounts went as far east as Kansas. Years before we became a nation. And of course, St. Augustine, Florida, as most of us know, is the oldest continuous settled city in the country, was a part of Florida, which of course was owned by Spain at that time. So, the second major, but Jamestown was the first, mainly commercial. Then we had a group of people who wanted to separate from the Church of England. Remember, Henry VIII had declared that he was the head of the Church of England when he divorced and wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. The Pope would give him a divorce. He declared, I will establish an English church and will be the head of it. At that time, of course, it was considered fairly generally accepted that God himself had ordained the ministers and the Pope specifically, or the head of a church, to be the dictator and the arbiter of anything religious, and the king to be the dictator and the arbiter of everything not religious, of the secular part of the country. Now, the doctrine of divine rights. Not only were ministers considered divine, but kings were considered divine, and that they felt, and it was generally acknowledged that they received their warrant not through any common consent, but through an act of God. It was a very convenient thing for the kings and the ministers, of course, to feel that way, because that gave them arbitrary authority and that they did not hesitate to exercise. There were a group of young people, mainly young people in England, who didn't like to have the whole idea of having a separate English church. The Anglican Church declared the official Church of England. They wanted to separate completely from that. However, most of the people in England accepted that the fact that Henry VIII was indeed the spiritual as well as the secular leader of the English church and of course the English kingdom. They accepted that. These pilgrims, they called themselves pilgrims. They were of course not very popular. They were actually persecuted to the extent that they decided, in order to practice what they believed in their conscience to be their interpretation of religion, that they had to leave England. They went first to Holland. Holland at that time was a very powerful country, but Holland was relatively tolerant of religious diversity at that time. Certainly more tolerant than any European country. They moved to Holland, to Leyden, Holland, spent a few years there, and began to realize that their children especially were going to adopt ways that they didn't feel were in accord with their religious ideas. They had to find a new place to settle. They wanted a new Jerusalem. They hoped that they could find a place somewhere on this planet that they could rule themselves in the way they wanted to rule, teach religion as they felt it should be taught. So they were able to go to England and charter the Mayflower, as we know, and sailing from Plymouth, England, they sailed across the Atlantic, got a charter from the king to settle established a colony in Virginia. Now, Virginia at that time was everything from what we now think of as the bottom of South Carolina all the way up at least to the Philadelphia area. That was the area that had been named Virginia for the Virgin Queen, Queen Bess, the Virgin Queen. She named it herself, after herself. They sailed from Plymouth and they got completely off course, ended up landing on what is now the coast of what is now New England, Massachusetts, as we know. Theoretically, they stepped off the boat on Plymouth Rock. That too is disputable, but the point is they did settle in that area, and it was an area which is now about 30 miles or so south of Boston, as we know. There were in that group of people, how many, let me remember again, refresh my memory. There were 101 settlers who came across with the Pilgrims, of course, and they landed on the Mayflower and landed, and of course, on the trip over, I think only a few died on the ship. Of the 101 people who finally landed on the shore on what is now Plymouth, near what is now Plymouth, England, close to Plymouth Rock, of that number, only 87 of them considered themselves saints. They called themselves saints or pilgrims. The rest were adventurers whom they had picked up in England to fill out the capacity of the ship, and also people who they felt they could use as servants and as military help, because most of them had no military background whatever, of the Pilgrims themselves. Among the military people they brought aboard the Mayflower was a man named Miles Standish. But the main man who was in charge of that group, incidentally, was William Bradford. He was the leader of that small group of pilgrims who left Holland, came to England, sailed from Plymouth, England, and landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts, what is now Plymouth, Massachusetts, and established a colony. In the first winter, more than half of them died because they had expected. Remember, their commission had been to land in Virginia. Virginia would have had a climate, at least, that may have made it much more compatible to their needs. They were hardworking people. They were unlike the people who landed at Jamestown. They were willing to work, but the land, as you know, even those of you who may be from Massachusetts, is not entirely agriculturally oriented, let's say. It's generally rocky. There's relatively little land that is good for farming, and they had, of course, had to subsist basically on farming. Luckily, they made friends with enough of the Indians that by the second year they were there, 1621, they had learned how to grow corn, and they'd learned how to harvest the wild animals, mainly the animals and the turkeys. And they had the first Thanksgiving. We still celebrated that Thanksgiving Day that they had. But they did not come for commercial reasons. They came for ideological reasons, for theological reasons. They came because they felt that God had ordained them to set up a new Jerusalem, a city on the hill that would become a model of Christian charity for the whole Christian world to emulate. They were very zealous, very, very, very and completely religiously oriented. That was their mission. Their mission was religious. It was not commercial in any way, unlike Jamestown. And it gave a flavor which was confirmed 10 years later when the Massachusetts Bay Colony under John Winthrop was able to organize a flotilla of 17 ships and more than 1,000 settlers who came and established another colony north of Plymouth on Massachusetts Bay, around the area which we now, as we know, clustered around what is now Boston. They were the big colony. Plymouth always was a subservient colony. What was the difference religiously between the people who settled Massachusetts Bay and the people who settled Plymouth? The main difference was that the people who settled Massachusetts Bay were Anglicans. They did not want to break away separate from the Church of England. They wanted to purify that church of what they felt was too many of the aspects in that church's doctrines and traditions that still were Roman Catholic. And remember, the English church broke away from the Catholic Church. Therefore, many in the English church decided, well, if it's an English church, we must have new traditions. We must have a completely different set of procedures, of sacraments from the Catholic Church. They wanted to purify the church of what they felt to be the idolatry of many of the Catholic Church and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. They did not want to separate from the Anglican Church, but they wanted to purify it. But most of the Englishmen were perfectly willing to stay as Anglicans and to accept what they had been before, the rituals that were so similar to the Catholic churches that there was not a great distinction, as we all know. Even today, as we know, the American Episcopal Church, especially the High Episcopalian, some of the rituals in that church are not too far different from many of the Catholic rituals still. The point being, we had two groups of people living close to each other. The Pilgrims down in Plymouth, who were very, very idealistically concerned with becoming completely separate theologically and idealistically, separate from the Anglican Church. And in Boston, a much bigger colony, which was willing to stay, to call themselves Anglicans, but they wanted to purify the church of what they felt to be the hangovers and the relics of its Catholic heritage. So those were the two major groups. The Virginians they were nominal. They weren't very religious at all, to be honest with you, but they were perfectly willing to call themselves Anglicans, although religion was not the main impetus in any way of the Jamestown colony. So in effect, we had the New England colonies, both the Plymouth colony and the Massachusetts Bay colony, which was much bigger, both very, very religiously inclined, and their whole objective in coming to America and their hopes in being in America was to set up a church that would, in the Puritans' case, purify that church without separating necessarily from the church in England. Gradually, they came to realize that that was impossible and that they had to separate. But initially, they did not intend to separate from the Church of England, as the Pilgrims did. So there we have the first two major settlements in America, the one down in Virginia at Jamestown, the one in New England at Plymouth, and Massachusetts Bay, which later Boston became its hub, as we all know. And of course, in that Boston group, there was a man named Endicott. By the way, Endicott had come over with a small group of pilgrims, of Puritans rather, in 1628. He preceded the main group, who came in 1630, by 2 years. And when the main group came with more than 1,000 people, there were 300 or 400 under Endicott's leadership who had preceded them and had, in effect, prepared the way for them to come, and had already acquired some land, made some friends and some enemies among the Indian tribes. But essentially, they were a well-financed, a well-educated. Most of the leaders of that colony in Massachusetts Bay were college graduates of England. Most of them Oxford or Cambridge. Most of them from Cambridge. But the point is, they were well-educated men. Unlike the Pilgrim colony in Plymouth, a few of whom, including Bradford himself, had an education, but most were. They were literate, but they were not educated in the sense that they had been brought up in the educational tradition of Cambridge and Oxford universities in England. So much for the first two major colonies. The one that became, of course, Massachusetts, and the other one became eventually Virginia, as we know. Well, obviously, that was the beginning. But Lord Calvert, who was a Catholic, his father had been very influential before King Henry broke away from the Catholic Church, and Henry and his predecessors had borrowed much money from the Calvert family while they were all Catholics. In other words, the king, who was by then James I, owed money to the Calvert family. young Calvert accepted as a part of the debt to the king. The king owed his family a tract of land in what is now Maryland to set up a refuge in the New World, mainly for Catholics who, at the time, remember, England had turned away from the Catholic Church. Henry VIII had destroyed or confiscated most of the monasteries and most of the Catholic holdings, but there were still many, especially up in Norfolk County and Suffolk County, up on the Wash in England, who retained their Catholic faith. There was a large group but a minority of Catholics in England, and Calvert was among that group, and he wanted a refuge for those Catholics who wanted to emigrate to the New World. He got a charter from the king to establish a royal colony in Maryland in 1634, only 4 years after the big Massachusetts Bay Colony had been settled. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, there soon developed people who, they were dictatorial. They were not looking for freedom of religion. They were looking for freedom of my religion, the way I see the world. They demanded absolute adherence to what the ministers, and there was no distinction between the ministry and the secular authorities. They worked together. There was no separation of church and state. The church and state in Massachusetts was one and all. In terms of power and influence, were one. There were many men, educated men, who began to question the dictatorial insistence that everybody do things the way the leaders wanted them to do it. One of those people was a young minister named Roger Williams, a very, very influential and powerful speaker. He gathered a group of followers, and gradually he would talk to them about let's in effect liberalize some of the rules and regulations and expectations that the leaders and the ministers of our colony want us to follow. That didn't sit well with the leaders, of course, and they tried to talk Roger Williams out of his, what they considered heretical views, but he adhered to them and gathered a group of people who listened to him and were willing to follow him, and ended up being banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he took his group of followers south and established a new colony, Rhode Island. He called the city Providence. He felt Providence had given him a place to go of refuge. And he established a colony which became the state of Rhode Island, down on the south of Boston, as we know, down on the Sound. So Connecticut was established. Now none of these had a royal charter at that time. They were simply working under grants that the king had granted, mainly to some of his favorite courtiers. But Rhode Island was established absolutely independently. It was the first one that was established without any royal sanction. Royal permission, yes, but not royal sanction. It never did have a charter or a proprietary status that most of the other colonies had. Similarly, now why did I put North Carolina next? I'm kind of proud to be from there. It didn't become a colony for years after that, but it was close to Virginia. A lot of the Virginians, remember, Virginia had a rather aristocratic view of itself, even as it grew. There were a lot of young, especially relatively uneducated, and I must admit, mostly illiterate, but independent-minded, young, mainly farmers or other people. Remember, where did the population come from? Largely indentured servants, which were in effect wage slaves to the people they were indentured to. They weren't actual slaves like the blacks became. The first black slave ship, incidentally, landed off Virginia in 1619, and they brought 20 slaves. That started the slave trade on the new American colonies. But they maneuvered across south of the main Jamestown area across the line of what is now North Carolina, down on the Albemarle Sound area in northeastern North Carolina. I happen to have been born there, and I guess I'm a descendant of what William Byrd called lubberland. People who were lazy and didn't want to work because you could live off the land pretty easily down there. The climate was nice, there was plenty of wild game, and you could even grow scuppernong grapes and make wine out of it. In other words, North Carolina was poor cousins, very poor cousins of Virginians initially. It didn't become a state or even a colony until decades later. But it was settled as early as 1653. A significant number by then had moved south out of Virginia into what is now North Carolina. New York, say 1664. But nope, Manhattan Island and the Hudson River had been owned by the Dutch long before it became New York. It was called New Amsterdam, as we all know. And the Dutch controlled it. And they controlled it for years. They bought it for $24 worth of trinkets from the Indians. They bought Manhattan Island. Boy, what a bargain. And they ran it for many years. If you want to read about that, read Washington Irving's history of it's rather comical. He makes a lot of fun of the Dutch, but the Dutch were very powerful in those days. They had sailed up the Hudson River, and they had settled the land on both sides of the Hudson River pretty far north of New York City, and they owned Manhattan Island for many decades. It was not until 1664 that the English were able to send a naval group to take over Manhattan and the Dutch settlements in Manhattan and up the Hudson River, and it became, in 1664, a royal colony. And they renamed it New York rather than New Amsterdam after the Duke of York. New Jersey, again, the Berkeley family. They were a group of courtiers who also the king owned debts to, and they granted them a tract of land which became the state of New Jersey. There was the first North Jersey and South Jersey. It was two separate colonies. They were later merged into the colony of New Jersey and got a royal charter in 1664, about the same time that New York was taken over. South Carolina began to be settled by people largely, Englishmen largely, who had settled in the West Indies islands off the coast, Barbados, Cuba, Antigua. My grandfather came to North Carolina in 1845 from the island of Antigua. He was born in Ipswich, England. But the point is, a lot of the people who had settled those offshore islands, who were mainly English, not all English, but the large proportion were English, came to what is now Charleston, South Carolina, and established a fairly viable colony there, which later became the state of South Carolina. New Hampshire. It had been settled by people from the Boston area, very much like Roger Williams. Oh, and did I mention Connecticut? Thomas Hooker. I'd skipped Connecticut. Forgive me for doing that. Very important. Thomas Hooker, a minister who, like Roger Williams, was not comfortable with the dictatorial attitudes that pervaded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he took a group of his followers and moved down and established the city of Hartford, Connecticut. And a group later came down and established a colony, a smaller colony, in what was what is now New Haven, Connecticut. Those two cities became the hubs of the state that became the colony of Connecticut, or the area that became the colony of Connecticut. And that happened very, very early, 1635, only 5 years after the main Massachusetts Bay Colony had settled. In other words, the two dissidents in the Massachusetts Bay Colony were Roger Williams, established Rhode Island, Thomas Hooker, who established Connecticut. Now let's jump on back down. New Hampshire, a lot of people, remember these people were spreading out. How were they living? They were living on small farms and they had to scatter. They had to grow their own crops largely or catch animals and sell furs or do whatever they could to stay alive. Many of the people had emigrated northward into what is now New Hampshire. And it wasn't until 1679 that New Hampshire, which had been dominated by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, got a charter of its own and became one of the colonies, years after the Massachusetts Bay Colony had been established in 1630. Pennsylvania, William Penn. He was a young man whose father was distressed when he became a Quaker. He was threatening to disown his son. Luckily, he died before he actually disinherited his son, William Penn. And the kings were, remember, they had courtiers who owned land, estates. The king had borrowed money from his father, from William Penn's father. In order to pay back that money, the king gave William Penn a tract of land which he called the colony of Sylvania. And the king himself decided it won't be just Sylvania, it'll be Pennsylvania, named after young Penn himself. It was really named after his father, whom the king owed the money to. William Penn established Pennsylvania as a refuge largely for the Quakers, who were considered to be, especially by the New England Puritans, rather outcast, they wouldn't take orders the way people are supposed to do. They wouldn't take orders from the ministers, and they wouldn't take orders from the secular authorities. And they became very, very unpopular. Indeed, it was unsafe to be a Quaker in New England. But Penn established a refuge not only for the Quakers in England, whom he had joined, but for the Quakers who were disaffected with the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the area around it, and they established a colony, the Royal Colony of Pennsylvania, in 1681. Delaware what is now Delaware had been settled largely by a small Swedish group who had come up the Delaware River and had settled that area. But they didn't have the resources, because Sweden simply did not have the resources, or weren't willing to spend the resources, even under King Adolphus, Gustavus Adolphus. He was the main king of Sweden. So the Swedes were pretty much absorbed by the Pennsylvanians and eventually became a separate colony of Delaware, which started out as being an area of Pennsylvania largely settled in origin by Swedish people. Georgia didn't come along until much later. By then, the king had given the proprietors of Carolina, and they called what is now North and South Carolina simply Carolina. The king had given the proprietors, a group of proprietors, a charter for that land, and there was a tremendous pressure from the south of what is now Georgia, mainly by the Spanish. Remember, the Spanish owned Florida. They had settled St. Augustine. They had colonized Florida. They had made friends with the Indians in that area. And therefore, the English were very, very, very concerned to protect their lands to the north of what is now Florida from an incursion by the Spanish from Florida. And under General Oglethorpe, they sent a group of people. Many of them were people who were in debtor's prison. They were allowed to join the Oglethorpe's group and come to establish a new colony, which was intended to be a buffer colony between the Carolinas and Florida against the incursions of the Spanish, the possible incursions of the Spanish. And Oglethorpe was a very well organized, a good administrator, a good military man. He brought the colony to Georgia, but you notice, very late, 100 years, more than 100 years after the establishment of Massachusetts Bay, did Oglethorpe set up his colony in Georgia with the king's permission at that point. Now we got 13 colonies, and I've got a few minutes left. Let's talk about some of the things that, by the way, any of you have any questions or comments? I've given you a broad brush treatment. Quite obviously, there was a lot of intrigue going on between the English king and all of these proprietors and colonists. They were not always happy with what was happening, and so conflicts began fairly early on. Remember, it had begun. The whole colonization process had begun largely for religious reasons, especially in the most influential of the colonies, which was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which eventually absorbed the Plymouth Colony, by the way. The two were put together into the colony of Massachusetts. The Plymouth Colony, although it came first, was never economically or populationally very strong. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was much, much bigger, much, much more powerful, had much better educated men and a larger number of them, and eventually the Plymouth colony was simply incorporated into the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So, but even in the early years, there was a great deal of conflict. The whole Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay settlement had originated because of conflict with England, mainly over religious issues. The Virginia colony was never in great conflict with England because they were a commercial colony, and England was exploiting, or was happy to exploit, their commercial value, mainly for the tobacco and the furs and the various other things that they could import from the Virginia area. So from the very beginning, the 13 colonies in no way considered themselves united. They were in competition with each other, and many of them were in competition, or at least in conflict, with the mother country back home. So we started out in controversy, but the surprising thing is the two major trends that determined the direction of our country when it became one were the religious and the ideological, and to a certain extent the theological assumptions that were prevalent throughout New England, and the commercial, which was predominant in the Virginia colonies and the middle colonies in the South. Most of the colonies, other than Massachusetts Bay, were Pennsylvania, of course, it was a refuge. Maryland was a refuge for Catholics, Pennsylvania for Quakers, but they weren't religiously oriented primarily. They were mainly refuges so people could come and settle there. They didn't in any way emphasize their differences with the king or with the English control over their affairs. Massachusetts Bay did. Virginia to a lesser degree did, to a much lesser degree. But that's what started the conflict that eventuated in the colonies becoming separate completely from England. We'll go through that next time. I do want to say a few things about it, as we all have. And again, I'd rather defer this to next time, because this period I had planned simply to talk about the settlement of the original colonies and how they came to be settled and by whom and when. We've done that now. In the next period, I would like very much to talk about how those colonies gradually began to have common interests, not so much as friends of each other. They each considered themselves an independent colony, and eventually an independent state. They in no way wanted to be united into a country. At no point did they ever, even, and we'll talk about that later, even during and after the Revolution, there were a group of states or colonies that were objecting to things that had been imposed upon them by the mother country. They did not consider themselves to be, for many decades, they were still Englishmen living in America who their main argument was not with each other, but with England. They wanted little or nothing to do with each other. Of course, there was some migration among the colonies, but it was relatively minor. Most people, once they got settled, wondered, after all, how did you survive in the colony? You had a piece of land, or you had property. Remember John Locke's famous idea, the idea of natural rights. Jefferson brought it out in the Constitution, in the Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty. John Locke had said property. Jefferson said, property is assumed. Of course you have a right to property. Let's make it the pursuit of happiness. That's how the pursuit of happiness got there in place of property. But property was considered absolutely necessary. These people in Europe and England and the immigrants who came after them had no way to acquire property. Property was inherited. It was the sole possession of the family that inherited it. The individual person, the individual farmer, the yeoman, had no way at all to achieve anything that he could say, this is mine. Here we had a whole new area of the world where their property was available to the ordinary human being who could come over, and if he was willing to work, he could sustain himself and his family on a small plot of land and become self-sufficient, and by becoming self-sufficient achieved a certain stake in the society of which he wanted to be a part. It was a major attitudinal change on many of the parts of the immigrants who came, because here was a land where they could be free from the feudal lord, or from the king, or from the man to whom they owed obedience back home, and have a chance at least to be independent and to be their own keeper, rather than, in effect, the feudal slave of whoever they happened to be working for, or whose land they lived on. They didn't own the land. They were simply tenants of the land in Europe. Here they had a chance to own land. That was a major, major inducement for many, many immigrants for decades after, and to a certain extent still is, of course, as we all know. Okay. Remember, I was a teacher of literature long before I even thought about teaching history. If you want to know what it was like to live in the Salem, Boston area, back in the days of the Puritans, read one novel, Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. Hawthorne was a descendant of a judge in Boston, or in Salem, I should say. He did a tremendous amount of research and created a novel, the first really great classic novel of American literature, The Scarlet Letter. And if you read that novel, you'll get a feeling for what it must have been like to have lived in New England at the time that novel is set, which is a decade or two after the original settlers had got it going. By the time Hawthorne sets his novel, Boston had become a fairly important community, and so had Salem, Massachusetts, and many of the smaller communities around it. And in that novel, he gives you a flavor of what some of the controversies, some of the attitudes, some of the expectations, some of the problems that people had to deal with living in that country, in that section of the country at that time. There is no comparable novel, unfortunately, about the early days of Virginia. Although John Smith wrote an account of the settlement of Jamestown, John Smith was an advertiser. He did not even try to portray with any great emotional force the way people had looked upon themselves and the situation they found themselves in. He wanted immigration from Europe, from England and from the rest of Europe to come to Virginia, of course. All the colonists encouraged immigration. They wanted it very much. But John Smith was an advertiser, and you have to read what he wrote. And he wrote several tracts with a grain of salt, including that Pocahontas story that I mentioned earlier. In other words, he wrote pseudo-history. It's not that it doesn't have an element of history in it, of course it did. But you can't, let's put it this way. You take John Smith's writings with a grain of salt. And people did. Although, don't misunderstand me, he was a very competent man. He, by the way, had mapped on subsequent voyages after Jamestown, he had mapped the course of New England, and the Pilgrims used his maps when they got to New England to get some idea of the geography of the area where he had published some rather crude maps. So Smith was a very important man. Other literary things. There was a judge named Sam Sewell in New England. He was one of the 3 judges in the Salem witchcraft trials, which I'll talk about next time. It didn't take place until the late 1600s, when there was an outbreak of witchcraft, which was believed in universally across, as you remember, Spain, England, Italy, Germany, France were burning witches by the hundreds of those days. So it was nothing unusual about witchcraft. In fact, we were very lucky in this what became the U.S. to have an incident where only 20 people were ever executed for witchcraft. 19 of them were hanged and 1 was pressed to death. But that occurred in the late 1600s, which I'll talk more about next time. But my point is, Judge Sewell, who was one of the judges that condemned those people to death, he was a judge in Massachusetts, a very prominent man. And he kept a diary. The Puritans were very self-introspective. They felt that God had a plan for them, and that their job was to try to discern and to execute what they honestly believed to be God's plan. They were not free. Their idea was you lived a godly, righteous, and sober life, and if you didn't, we'll punish you. Why? Because we're all, according to the Calvinistic and Presbyterian, and to a certain extent, even the Anglican doctrines, the doctrine of original sin, the Calvinist doctrine of innate depravity. Mankind was innately depraved. We were inclined by nature toward evil. And God had predestined certain of us to be elect and to have an afterlife in heaven. The majority of us were condemned because we were innately evil into hell. Where did that doctrine come from? It came from the idea of the sin of Adam. We had inherited it. That was firmly believed in. There was no question about it in the Puritan's mind, that this was God's determination. And God being all both omnipotent and omniscient, he must have pre-known who was going up there and who was going down there. And the majority were destined there. Therefore, there was a great incentive on the part of these religiously minded New Englanders to act in such a way that would indicate that they must be one of those who were destined that way rather than that way. Most of us were destined that way. We had to be introspective. We had to examine everything that happened to us, every thought we had, every act we made, to see if it was in consonance with the possibility that we might be among the elect. Surprisingly, it sounds like a depressing doctrine, predestination. But it was firmly believed in largely because of the teachings of John Calvin and the Calvinists, which the Presbyterian Church and the Puritan Church adopted and accepted. So if you believe that only a few would be elect, you certainly wanted to be among those. So you, not only did you yourself feel obligated to live a godly, righteous, and sober life, but you felt obligated to punish anybody who didn't. Therefore, it became a very oppressive, very dictatorial, theological society, especially in New England. And because of that, surprisingly, people worked hard, making a success of life. If you did it honestly and righteously and by hard work and determination, that was a sign that you might be among those elect. So there was a great incentive to succeed in life, not at the expense of other people, but just for yourself. You did it righteously. That was necessary. But success was a mark of possible election, and it became a powerful incentive force for the whole Puritan expedition, the whole Puritan experiment. So, well, I've gone, I think, long enough. Next time we'll talk a little bit about, in more great detail, about how these 13 colonies gradually, very gradually, came to think of themselves not as Englishmen or Swedes or Frenchmen, mostly Englishmen. More than 80% by 1790 had English or Welsh backgrounds. How they came to begin to think of themselves not as Englishmen living in America, but as people who were going to remain in America and become what we now know of, Americans. Robert Frost's wonderful poem, I'll read it to you. Remember Kennedy's inauguration? We all remember that. He wrote a beautiful poem which I'll read and conclude this session. He was looking back and trying to imagine, as a good poet always does, what it must have felt like for these people who were Englishmen largely, living in a strange land, still owing obeisance to the mother country, still feeling loyal to the mother country, and coming to feel over time that the mother country no longer considered them valuable. Remember what he read? Remember that day at Kennedy's inauguration, the wind was blowing. He was trying to read the poem, it got blown around. Here's the poem. The land was ours before we were the land's. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people. She was ours in Massachusetts, in Virginia, but we were England's still colonials, possessed by what we were unpossessed by. In other words, we possessed the land, but the land didn't possess us yet. We didn't consider ourselves Americans. We were still Englishmen. We possessed the land, but the land didn't possess us. Possessed by what we were unpossessed by. Possessed by what we no longer possessed. English citizenship. We were proud to be Englishmen, always, up to a point. Something we were withholding made us weak until we found out that it was ourselves we were withholding from our land of living, and forthwith found salvation in surrender. Such as we were, we gave ourselves outright. The deed of gift was many acts of war to the land vaguely realizing westward, still unrestored, still unstoried rather, still artless, unenhanced, such as she was, such as she would become. The process of how this group of people, largely Englishmen, came to think of themselves and the land that they lived in as being something they had to surrender themselves to. Not any longer consider themselves Englishmen living on land, but land that they possessed and wanted to develop and wanted to associate themselves with. In other words, we now call them Americans. Thank goodness. Thank you. See you next week.